Well, I'm Jonathan Smith. I grew up here in New Albany. Um,
Wait, when were you born?
Back in 1977.
Okay.
Been a while. I went to school here in New Albany. Um, did the usual kind of, things through school, but the first time I remember really being excited about creating something, I think I was probably around 12, and there was a camp in Tupelo. There were different things offered, but there was a photography course, and for some reason I was really interested in it, and I don't remember how hard it was to talk my parents into it, but I did. And so every day for a week my mom drove me to Tupelo to take this course, and I cannot remember the name of the instructor, but he was a photographer with the Daily Journal, but he had previously been a photographer with National Geographic, and he had stepped down from that to be closer to home because he and his wife had just had their first child, and he didn't want to be away from home for weeks at a time. But it was I remember it as a really good class, and it was just the first time I'd really thought about photography, kind of visual storytelling. Something I think I have in my artist bio, and growing up in the South, storytelling tends to be a big part of just the daily life and culture here. And I, at my grandparents' house, sit on the porch and listen to them tell stories about their lives or the community and things like that. And so I always had that background, but I think that class was the first time I'd really thought about a visual component of it. So I guess for better or worse, when I was coming through, especially high school here, we didn't really have an art program in New Albany through the school. So I did different things, but I was always interested in photography and kept doing that. For whatever reason, it didn't occur to me as a high school student that you could make a career out of photography other than the people I knew who were photographers were either photojournalists, like that individual, and that wasn't I didn't think that was exactly what I wanted to do, or there were portrait photographers, and I knew that really wasn't what I was interested in doing. So through school I focused more on other things. Went to school for computer science at first, which I did enjoy because there's some element of creativity and just creating the programs and finding the most efficient way for the program to run. I always had that interest in storytelling, and I took a really kind of roundabout route to get back to that. I got tired of being in a cubicle all day, basically. I read a book on archaeology, and it's called In Small Things Forgotten by James Deeds. Kind of the gist of the book is about how you can tell the story of people who didn't really leave a written record about themselves. That was really interesting. Ended up jumping careers, spent several years as an archaeologist. And that was interesting because it's there's a lot of interpretation, but it's a very bounded interpretation by the data you have. And on the whole, I enjoyed that, but the company I was working for kind of ran out of money, and I didn't want to start over. I was already in my early 30s, and it's very physically demanding, and I was starting to feel it in my bones. So I came home. I was living and working in New Orleans then. I had gone to grad school in North Carolina, and while I was there, I took some photography courses through a local gallery, just kind of kept that part alive. And I did a short YouTube series on cemeteries in the region. It was the first time I'd ever really shot or done anything with video. Moved to New Orleans and was mostly working on the BP oil spill around 2010, 2011. So couldn't really take pictures or tell stories about that due to the contract we were on. But I took a lot of photographs in New Orleans. So when that job ended, I ended up coming back up here for a while to kind of figure out what I was going to do next. Ended up working at a local little community access TV station here and realized that I could pull all these bits together and kind of really start telling stories, documentary stories through photography and video. I mean, along the way I've done different things. I've always had an interest in blacksmithing. I did that for a while. Enjoyed and still enjoy it. It's become something I probably do more for myself rather than like kind of a public facing art. But the photography and filmmaking is designed to kind of share those stories.
So tell me about what's happening now.
Right, so I was fortunate enough to be able to be one of the, I like to call us the guinea pigs, the first cohort through the MFA program at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at Ole Miss, and MFA in Documentary Expression. MFA degree is the terminal degree in kind of that field, and what that means is the degree you'd have to teach at a university level. So since I already had a master's in anthropology, that kind of made sense from a career perspective, but also from kind of a from the creative side, because it was 2 years of really concentrated, intense storytelling, getting kind of critique that I'd never gotten before, kind of professional feedback. And that was great. I made several short films while I was there. Just different aspects of kind of life and culture around this area. That's something I've always been interested in, is kind of complicating the popular perception of the South. And I say complicating because it's not always about just telling the good stories to counteract kind of the negative stereotype. It's, looking at the past and the stereotypes, but then kind of expanding on where those came from. One of the main projects I did there, my thesis was on a lynching in Union County, the only one recorded, L.Q. Ivy in 1925. And I also had the chance to do some work with the Lynching Remembrance Group in Lafayette County. And they were putting up a memorial for Elwood Higginbottom, who was lynched in 1935 in Lafayette County. And I was kind of just on the fringe of that. I shot some video for them. I knew people who were much more involved in it. The New York Times covered it heavily, but the Times coverage was only with a handful of direct descendants. And as I talked to people, it was clear there was a lot more going on. So I interviewed Valerie Reeves, who is a member of the family who lives in Atlanta, a member of the Higginbottom family. And she's one of the main family historians, or one of the people who's done the most work with the genealogy and history of the family, and made a short film called Finding Elwood Higginbottom. And that film talked about the effect of the memorial on the greater family, or Valerie talked about in that film. But it was, for me, it was kind of a difficult subject, but mostly in it, I was trying to stay out of the way and let other people tell the story and just present it in a way that made sense visually in the short film. That particular film has done well. a couple of different groups have taken it to show at city council and community meetings at other towns throughout the South, and several of those towns have gone ahead with memorials of their own. So, I mean, the film's not the only thing that convinced them, but it's been really great that it's been part of making some actual change. And it aired in New York on WNET as part of their Real 13 program, where they pair a feature film and a short and air them together. That was kind of cool. Did a few other films. Sweet Sorghum is about just the sorghum making tradition in this area, because there's fewer and fewer people doing it. It's pretty labor intensive, and I really wanted to document that because I'd grown up around that. And another one that was just a really interesting story, and it's really kind of a Mississippi story, is Remembering Mittie Manning. Is that what I called it? I think that's what I called it. But she was a probably around 7-year-old, died in Holly Springs in the late 19th century. It was devastating for the family, the mother in particular. So she was buried in an above ground crypt with a viewing porthole that you could slide open to see her face. I think she was probably in what's called a Fisk coffin, which is a cast iron coffin that has a glass window inset in it, because they preserve the body really well. Like, I don't think they just laid her out on the ground and built a tomb over her. But there's no documentation either way, because as the months went by, apparently the preservation wasn't that great. Her mother's mental health was kind of declining as she was watching her daughter decay away. So father convinced her to bury the child. So she was buried, but they were used the same marker for her. So today there's still a slab, her name and details inscribed on it, in a porthole you can slide open. And it's become part of like the legends of Holly Springs, this kind of lore. But the grave was in really bad shape. It had been heavily damaged over the years from probably not, for the most part, intentional vandalism, but just so in my days in archaeology, one of the things I did was cemetery preservation, and power mowers are really hard on marble tombs that weren't really built to take, being bumped into by machinery or having rocks flung at them. So a group of locals got together and decided it needed to be preserved, so they came up with the money and did the labor themselves and restored the tomb. And the film documents that and her Mittie story, and then restoring the tomb and kind of the way it's survived in the local history today. So that was a really interesting film to make. That was kind of a COVID film too, because it was right as we were coming out of kind of the most severe restrictions and concerns about being together. So it was all filmed outdoors, so that was, timing worked. But yeah, so filmmaking and photography. I'm working on putting together a body of work for I want to put together a show around a couple of different themes. My photography's followed. Something that's kind of emerged in the past couple of years. I started out shooting film. I mean, that would have been around 1989, 1990, something like that when I took that class. So film is all there was. I switched to digital in the early 2000s and really liked some things about digital photography, but my filmmaking is all almost entirely digital, shot and edited as well. And I really wanted something that was to do something that was more hands-on. So for the photography, I'm moving more towards where, at the very least, the final prints are all handmade in some way. I've done a lot of cyanotype, and cyanotype is a very old process of making a print using a couple of different they're iron-based chemicals, and when you expose them to UV light, they react and turn blue. It's not what you think of when you think of iron. You think of like rusty red, but these turn blue. And the process is became the blueprint. So the traditional blueprints that are blue are this process. It also survived as kind of a quick and cheap way to make proofs of photographs back in the glass negatives days. And then it survived as more in the artistic printing. So I've done some work with that, and I'm working on some other kind of historic forms where, you know, basically everything's done by hand. The paper, I select the paper and coat it with the right chemistry and expose it and develop it in the different ways. And I've also learned and was lucky enough to get a couple of grants from the Mississippi Arts Commission to pay to go to workshops to learn the wet plate method, which almost nobody recognizes, but it's a tintype, like a Civil War tintype, is a type of wet plate photograph, and it's called wet plate because everything has to be done while the chemistry's still wet. So you take either, these days we use enameled aluminum or glass for like a negative or an ambrotype. So you take your aluminum or glass, you coat it with what's called collodion. It's gun cotton dissolved in ether and thinned with alcohol. And gun cotton is just cotton that's dissolved in nitric acid, basically. And it was developed, its first use in the early 19th century, or mid 19th century, was in medicine because it forms this clear, flexible substance that you can like paint over a wound and it'll hold it closed. But Frederick Scott Archer in the 19th century figured out that if you added salt, different types of salts, to it, and then added silver, it would become light sensitive and you could use it to make a photograph. And that became the first first popular photographic method. It was immediately after the daguerreotype. But the advantage of this process is you could make negatives if you did it on glass. So then you could transfer those to paper prints and make a bunch of prints from one negative. Also a huge history buff, so I can go on a long story about that process, but I really like that process because it's very handmade. You see the traces of the photographer throughout the whole thing. So if I'm shooting glass negatives, I can go on and make a print using one of the other processes on paper, and it's handmade from start to finish. For the digital prints, still shoot digital. I can take those and convert those to black and white and basically print on a clear sheet and a transparency basically, but it's made to hold more ink and so more detail. And I can print that out and use it the same way you would as a film negative to make the prints. And I think for me that's kind of just a reaction to the digital being so easy to reproduce, because these are harder. You can scan a cyanotype and print it on a color printer, but it won't look the same. It won't have the same texture. Tintype you can't really reproduce. You can get metal, you can print on metal plates, but they don't look the same because the way a tintype works, the way the whole wet plate process works, you pour your collodion on the plate, let it dry, you dip it in a silver bath, and it's just a form of silver dissolved in water. Then when it's exposed to light, that silver builds up on the surface. So instead of being like black ink laid down over a silver surface, it's that reflective silver on a dark surface, and there's no process that really reproduces that now. I think I just like that it is handmade, that you can see the creator's hand in it. Also, they're really the archival, digital. I don't know how long it'll last, because even if the media lasts, there may not be a computer that will read it in 10 years, much less 50 or 100. A wet plate photograph, or like a wet plate negative, is silver sealed under a protective layer on glass. It'll probably last centuries, so there's a little bit of that. So that's what I'm doing now. When I'm not working, I'm currently working at the University of Mississippi in the theater and film department in the film program, and I'm the film equipment manager, which means I handle all the equipment and a lot of the to do with the facility and teach students how to use it. I'm there if they have questions, and then I adjunct teach as they have need, basically. So I've taught editing and done tutorials and a whole bunch of other things. And so yeah, that's what I'm doing now, and as I continue to develop these, I'm looking at a couple of projects that will combine the audio and like film to make like a video, but also include some of the photography to do an exhibit or to do a piece on. There's a couple of different topics I'm looking at, but I'm looking at ways to combine those. Yeah.
Your thesis that you did for your program on LQ Ivy, where was it shown?
So my thesis project was a hybrid project. So there wasn't a film necessarily produced about it. There's a thesis I wrote, and there's a website that I need to check on. But there's a website that tells the story of LQ Ivy and links it to some of the other lynchings that happened. And it tells that story through the photographs and videos and spoken word and written word. So it was kind of an experiment in combining everything. There are a few photographs from the lynching. I mean, it's a really interesting story. There was a reporter who worked in Memphis, and from everything I've researched, he was basically just passing through on the train and heard that LQ had been arrested and hopped off the train and stayed here over the weekend and documented everything. And honestly, without him, probably the story wouldn't have gotten the attention it did. I think something a lot of people here don't realize, that story in 1925 went all the way to Congress, and one of the first attempts at an anti-lynching law came about in response to that event because it was so horrific. That one did not pass, but eventually one did. And it's because there was a reporter from Memphis, and he took several photographs. I don't know if any of his negatives survived. That's something I couldn't find. I found some high quality scans of the article that included the photographs, so I included some of those. But I mean, that article was released on the International Wire, so kind of like the Associated Press. I can't remember offhand if it was the Associated Press or one of the other news services, and was picked up around the world. There's a article I found from Dutch Java written about it, which would be in Indonesia. And that was, I think that particular article was probably 2 months after it happened, but it had just been making its way through the wire services.
Were you able to get people to talk to you about it?
Not really. So the people who, at this point, anybody who was there is pretty much passed on, and had probably by the late 90s, most of them had passed on. There were a couple of newspaper articles written, one in the 70s and one in the 90s, that interviewed people who were there, and I drew heavily on those. And One person who'd written the article was willing to talk to me, but probably more because he knew me. The person who wrote the article in the 90s didn't want to meet or talk about it. I don't know what all had happened to her after she wrote it, but she didn't want to talk to anybody. So no, there wasn't a lot of local interest in the story.
Well, her reaction tells you that it was powerful.
Yeah.
The response to it,
Yeah.
not in a good way.
No. I mean, said it happened. Not talking about it won't make it go away. It's literally documented all over the world at this point. So yeah, I know there's some other people who've been working on aspects of the story and maybe publishing a book eventually. So she was somebody who was able to interview some people who were still alive, so it'll be interesting to see the reaction. It'll probably be more of an academic publication though. Yeah.
Have you ever had a public showing of your photography?
So I've had several showings as part of group exhibits or theme shows. I mean, so I took some photography workshops when I was working on my master's degree in North Carolina. And I had a piece in, I think it was the 2008 Schwa Show, which is the show that the gallery in Greenville, North Carolina puts on, and it's a nationally juried show. So one piece of mine was selected for that year's show. That was probably the first time I had like any sort of real gallery showing. I think it was the 2008 show. That was the first time I had kind of really anything in a public showing. I think that workshop back when I was like 12, we may have shown some photos. And I entered several local shows after that and had work in some of the galleries around North Carolina. And then as a student in the MFA program, I had work shown in the Gamble Gallery at Barnard Observatory at Ole Miss, a couple of different shows. And since then I've had some pieces up in Oxford and shows there, and the Yoknapatawpha Arts Council has a program where they've partnered with different places around Oxford. And so I was able to do a solo show last January 2024, I guess, in City Grocery. And that was kind of cool. I think I called it Mississippi Blues because it's all cyanotype prints. So, and they were Southern Blues because they weren't all from Mississippi, but they were all from places throughout the South. And it was mostly photos from the past few years, but there's a few that went back a little further. And it went well. And I'd like to do more shows. Like I said, I'm trying to put together a body of work that would have a cohesive theme and be ready to go up in a gallery. That's kind of a current project. Along the way, there's a program at the University of Mississippi that John T. Edge started, and it's the Staff Creative Residency Award. It's going into its 4th or 5th year. It's a really unique program there, but the idea is you can apply. If you're accepted, you get a paid week to work on your whatever creative endeavor you want to pursue. You get a stipend of a few $100, $300-$400. And then you get support through that program in your cohort, so you're not just out there alone. and I was accepted for that in 2023 and chose to focus on the cyanotype as a way to get started in these kind of antique processes, photographic processes. And spent a week working on that, and then was able to get, they call it their winter residency, but it's like an add-on, so you get a few days in the winter of the following year and an extra $100 or something to go towards whatever you need it for. So in my case, the original money I used to buy some of the equipment I needed to do the cyanotypes, and then I used the additional money to put together that show at City Grocery to buy the paper and materials for it. And I've been lucky enough to get two, I think I mentioned but didn't go into detail, I've been lucky enough to get two Mississippi Arts Commission mini grants. The first one was applied in fall of 2023 for the spring 2024 grant cycle, and I used it to go up to West Virginia to learn the wet plate process from Lisa Elmaleh. She's a photographer who does a lot of work in wet plate and film, and almost all of her work is large format 8x10 film or wet plate. Her current project involves a lot of work along the border working with immigrants, but she's done several different things. She won the Guggenheim Fellowship last year, and then I got an additional grant to go back up this year. I went the 1st of June and took her, she calls it the advanced workshop, but it's an additional couple of days to focus on whatever aspect you really need to work on. So I spent that time working on making negatives, because they're a little more tricky than a tintype. So those all together have been some great opportunities that let me, make more progress in all of the cases, make more progress in a few days than I probably could have in a year just fumbling around by myself.
How does one get started or interested in blacksmithing?
So as far as the blacksmithing goes, I've always been interested in it, always been interested in kind of not just history, but kind of the way people lived in the past before, there was like a Walmart. My grandfather on my father's side he did some blacksmithing work, he did some farrier work, and he had a forge behind their house when I was growing up. And he passed away when I was fairly young. How old was I? 6 or 7, maybe 8. So I didn't really get to work with him much, but I'd seen it done and kind of knew what happened. And my father was interested, and had done some when he was younger, but he didn't really have a chance to do much, when my brother and I were younger. So it's something I'd known about and always been interested in. I mentioned working in archaeology. The downside of that is most of the time I was working in archaeology, probably 3 weeks out of every month I was in the field, which meant I was living out of a hotel room, sometimes a different hotel room every night or two. And blacksmithing's not very portable, so I couldn't really pursue that. But when I moved back here and kind of ended up settling a little bit, I had time and a place to do that. So I ended up, it seems like I probably learn better in the initial stages if I have an instructor. So there's a program in Alabama, the Alabama Folk School at Camp McDowell. It's a great program. They do music, different traditional crafts. They do things like quilting. I think they've got a pie making weekend coming up. But one of their courses was blacksmithing. So I ended up going and doing a weekend workshop there, and the instructor was Lee McKee, and got to know him. and I was really into it. Came back and ended up building a forge. Had access to my dad's workshop, so I welded up a metal table basically, and used a brake drum for the fire pot, which is the part that holds the burning coal and lets air in. So it has to be a really sturdy metal, just so it doesn't burn through. So I built that and worked with that for a while. Ended up going back to the folk school. They had a workshop on building a propane forge, and built a little propane forge. Got to know some of the people there, and I went to Birmingham several times to work with the group. It was the Sons of Vulcan in Alabama that Lee had started, and they had a small business doing blacksmithing and metalworking in general. They built a lot of things for some of the breweries that were opening up in Birmingham at the time. Everything from the supports for the brewing vats to the bar furniture and just different things. Fortunately, Lee was killed in a car accident several years ago. We kept on working, and got to know some of the people down in Jackson. Worked a lot with Lal Wynn, who's an excellent blacksmith. He's probably one of the longest standing members in the the Mississippi Craftsman's Guild. He's one of the blacksmiths in it. Took some lessons from him. He was nice enough to invite me down there for a weekend and let me play around in his shop. And that really, all that together, I think really jump-started things. So I did that for how many? 4 years, maybe 5. I enjoyed it. I did a lot of craft shows, selling different things, and did a few demonstrations. I did some here at the museum, some at a few other places. It's something I did and do enjoy, but the sort of things I didn't enjoy, the almost assembly line process of making a lot of identical things to sell at craft shows. And it was really hard to break into anything larger because there's not a huge demand, especially here in North Mississippi. A lot of the blacksmiths I know who do nothing but blacksmith full-time are doing either new construction, doing architectural features like railings and fireplace surrounds and things like that, or they do restoration work. We don't have a lot of either of those here. One of the blacksmiths I got to know worked in, I think it was Wyoming, but he would make a handful of chandeliers a year, but each one was $250,000. So it was time consuming, but it paid a living wage. And this wasn't the right place for that. There's just not that much disposable income in North Mississippi. So I enjoyed it, but it wasn't a way. I couldn't find a niche to make a living that I was comfortable with. So still do some, would like to get back into it more. Got to do some repairs on my forge. But hopefully I plan to continue doing some work with it. I think I'd really like to get back in the forge. For one thing, there's work on making some kind of mounts and frames for some of the photography and combine those. There's a type of photography, it's called an ambrotype, and it's wet plate. It's a positive wet plate image on glass. What that means is it's a one of a kind. It's shot directly on the glass, but on a dark background. It's technically a negative. When you put it on a dark background, it looks like a positive image, like what you'd see with your eyes. And they can be really hard to mount because traditional frames, they don't look great. You really need a little bit of depth between the glass and the background. So it's a chance to try different styles of framing that are look different and more unique than just, you know, putting it in a pre-made frame. It's kind of just something I've always wanted to do in a way. So I grew up listening to stories, always wanted to tell them somehow. Thought I was going to be a writer for a while, but I enjoy writing, but that wasn't the right calling either. I don't know. I just really enjoy telling the stories, all sorts of stories. These days it's become more, I call it documentary because almost everything's based in, there's a phrase that I came across in the studies, it's based in actuality. So the idea of being actuality is the event that sparks something, person, an event, whatever. Reality is the way we perceive it. So the actuality, all the stories have some event that led to their creation. And I think that's kind of what kind of drives me right now, is just finding ways to tell stories that are generally grounded in some kind of real world event, and different ways to explore that, to let people, give people the opportunity to learn about that or think about that, whatever event it is, in ways they haven't before. So that's why these days, I wouldn't say everything's strictly documentary, because like in photography, there's a lot of creativity and different ways to present vision. It's not so, but it's all kind of grounded in something in the world that I want to explore and see how other people react and explore.